Hi there, thanks for visiting. My name is Simon Williams and I'm a principal with Edmonton Public Schools. This video is called Amiskwaciy-wâskahikan, Mapping Indigenous Edmonton, and this is part 2 of a video that I'm posting as my act of reconciliation. In the first video, we looked at the Edmonton area from a geological and archaeological perspective, focusing on land and water features. If you didn't get a chance to view that video, maybe start there first. In this video, we'll begin to look at the impact of contact and colonization on Indigenous people. The aim of the project is to promote a re-examination of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on this land. So it's important to note that I am not Indigenous. My family moved here from England, and so I'm a beneficiary of Treaty 6 and of the Papa's Chase land surrender. Here's a look at the digital version of the original painted map, and dealt with this a lot in the first video. In this, I've included significant geographical features and used plants and medicines to represent direction, and these were discussed already. The map also shows animals, which I chose for reasons of particular significance that we'll continue to explore as we go along. These paths in light brown show traditional traveling routes and trade routes that crisscross where our community now lies and would have brought together Indigenous people to gather, engage in ceremony, and exchange goods. Indigenous people have lived on this plot of land in the Edmonton area for at least 8,000 years. And that's a number and a concept that I've really struggled to understand. So I've created a visual and auditory timeline to help represent 8,000 years. 12,000 years ago, Edmonton was covered by the ice and snow of the Little Wisconsin Ice Age. Over time, the glaciers began to melt and a glacial lake was formed. An ice dam holding back the waters burst, and the water carved out our river valley in a succession of floods. As the ice retreated, animals began to move into the area, and 9,000 years ago, bison began to inhabit this area, and they left their bones in the sediment layers. 8,000 years ago, Indigenous people began to live on this land. The music that you hear represents their culture and their way of life. Each inch on the timeline represents 1,000 years that Indigenous people raised their families and built their communities in harmony with Mother Earth. At this point in Egypt, the Great Pyramids were built and people had frequented the Edmonton area for almost 4,000 years. At this point in Europe, there was the rise and fall of first the Greek and then the Roman empires, followed by the birth of Christianity. 1,000 years ago, the Vikings came to the eastern coast of Turtle Island. 500 years ago, Jacques Cartier arrived. Just over 100 years ago, the country of Canada was formed. Those 8,000 years provide some perspective about the significance of the 150 or so years that are represented by that 1 second of O Canada that we just heard, compared to the 53 seconds of Northern Cree. It also makes me question the use of the term immigrants by European non-Indigenous Canadians, referring to other newcomers who might not look the same as them or who have a different belief system. Moving back now to our mapping project. To the east of Edmonton and Sherwood Park, the land is marked by a moraine left behind by melting glaciers. The Aspen Parkland is unlike the boreal forest to the north and west, or the grasslands to the south, and the land is about 20 meters higher than Edmonton. This area is known scientifically as the Cooking Lake Moraine, and more commonly as the Beaver Hills, or in Cree, amiskwaciy. It is after these hills that Amiskwaciy Academy takes its name. Amiskwaciy Academy is an Edmonton public school with a focus on supporting Indigenous students. The Amiskwaciy served as a key meeting place for Indigenous peoples who utilized this area's vast resource base. The hills offered a place where they could recoup after spending an extended time on the plains, a place where they could hunt, fish, and gather other needed resources, and also as a place of last refuge in times of hardship, conflict, or sickness. The area was named for the amisk, the beaver, that abounded in the many ponds and lakes. For this reason, I included a beaver in the top right-hand corner of my map. In the 1790s, competition between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company was fierce, with both companies trying to expand their trade to the west. In the summer of 1795, the Northwest Company set up their first trading post in the area, Fort Augustus, near the Amiskwaciy. It was at the confluence of the North Saskatchewan River and the Sturgeon River. Later, in the autumn of 1795, the Hudson's Bay Company established Edmonton House, only a musket shot away from their competition, for protection. They named it Edmonton House, or Fort Edmonton, and this was the first of 5 forts to bear that name. The name Edmonton was a reference to Edmonton, Middlesex, a borough of London in England, which was the home of Sir James Winterlake, who was the deputy governor of the Hudson's Bay Company at the time. The Cree referred to these 2 forts as amiskwaciy-wâskahikan, meaning Beaver Hills House. To the Nakota Sioux, the forts were known as Teoda, meaning many houses. The Blackfoot called the forts Makowis, meaning big lodge. To the French speakers, the forts were sometimes referred to as Fort des Prairies and Fort Sans Pareil. In 1797, as many as 12,512 beaver furs were traded at Fort Edmonton. But by 1800, the volume of furs traded started to drop and much of the firewood in the area had been cut down. So, in 1802, it was decided to move the forts upstream to an area where the First Nations in the region had a history of trade that long predated the fur trade. The Beaver Hills House Park is a tribute to the history of the area. The Rossdale Flats, where the fort was relocated, was a significant place for Indigenous people for thousands of years before the Europeans came. This area is sometimes referred to as a pehonan, which means waiting place, or otanau, a gathering place, and this was the center of trade, celebration, and ceremony. The flats represent some of the earliest beginnings of settlement in Edmonton and were closely connected to the early fur trade. It was common for Indigenous and Métis people to camp on the river flats when trading at the fort. In this photograph from the early 1900s, you can see Indigenous people in teepees on the flats with Mackay Avenue School built in 1904 in the background. In all, there were 5 different versions of Fort Edmonton. The first we've seen was located in present-day Fort Saskatchewan. The second, Fort Edmonton II with Fort Augustus II a short distance away, was located on the Rossdale Flats. In 1810, the forts were briefly moved out to White Earth Creek near Smoky Lake, where they shared space within a common palisade wall. Then, in 1813, the forts returned to Rossdale Flats, where they remained until 1830, eventually merging after the takeover of the Northwest Company by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. The final fort was Fort Edmonton V, located on the lawn bowling green of today's legislative grounds. This part of the river valley around the flats appears to have had most of, if not all of the natural features that made the valley attractive to early people and fur traders alike. Unfortunately, however, the area is prone to flooding. In fact, without regular flooding, the flats wouldn't have been created. In 1825, heavy rainfall upstream resulted in significant flooding. These photographs from 1915 give a good indication of the impact of a 100-year flood. It's due to flooding like this that following the 1825 flood, a decision was made to relocate the fort up to higher ground. Here is a photograph that shows Fort Edmonton V, situated up on higher ground with sweeping views of the landscape as it was at the time. On the right-hand side, you can see the small number of buildings built outside the palisade walls at that time. When we understand that the fort was located in the center of Edmonton, it makes sense that people would have been buried also in this area. Rossdale was a burial ground for the people who lived at Fort Edmonton and the surrounding area and reflects the cultural diversity of Edmonton at the time. The Fort Edmonton Cemetery Memorial on the north side of the Walterdale Bridge beside the Epcor power plant is shaped as a stylized teepee, and the engraved stones pay tribute to those who were buried here between 1814 and 1871. The people buried here include 54 Métis, 25 Indigenous people, and 12 Euro-Canadians. The Indigenous people buried there include Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, and Cree. The memorial site honors these people and provides an interpretive experience for passers-by. Some people are named while others are described in simple terms. The cemetery reflects the cosmopolitan nature of the settlement and the strong influence of the Métis in early Edmonton. One example of a prominent Métis who figured in early Edmonton was Richard Hardesty. He was a chief factor for the Hudson's Bay headquarters in the Saskatchewan district based out of Fort Edmonton in 1872. These were years of constant change and adjustment. This was a time of hardship, hunger, and transition for First Nations and Métis at a time where bison were hunted to near extinction and treaty was forcing them from their lands. Through all of this, Hardesty was very well respected by First Nations, Métis, and settlers alike. In 1874, Hardesty built the first house outside the palisade walls of Fort Edmonton. In this photograph, Hardesty House can be seen in the top corner with two Red River carts on the left-hand side. Richard Hardesty became involved in politics and in 1888 was Canada's first Métis senator and the first senator from the Alberta district. Another influential Métis was Laurent Garneau. Laurent was a Métis who had fought alongside Louis Riel in the 1869 Red River Rebellion prior to moving here. Garneau homesteaded on river lot number 7, which can be seen here. Fort Edmonton on the opposite bank of the North Saskatchewan River could be seen from his cabin. Laurent was a talented fiddler and he was well known in the Edmonton music circles, but he was shunned by his neighbors when he became involved in the Edmonton Uprising of 1885. Later in his career, he was elected to the Northwest Territories Parliament in Regina, but he was refused entry due to his previous involvement with Riel. A little east of Garneau's lot was the river lot belonging to another Métis, William Bird. Through Bird's lot flowed a creek that was known in Cree as the amiskwaciy-wâskahikan, or Stoney Creek. In 1871, William Bird constructed a flour mill on the creek, and people started referring to it as the creek that flowed by Bird's Mill, and then eventually Mill Creek. With LRT development in the area now, a new pedestrian bridge in the area will be called the amiskwaciy-wâskahikan Bridge as a reference to the creek's earlier days. This is Chief Papasteo, also known as John Gladue-Quinn. He and his 6 brothers and their families moved to the Edmonton area in the late 1850s from the Lesser Slave Lake area. Their band settled here and traded with the Hudson's Bay Company and was employed for contract work with them from time to time. He was also known as Papa's Chase, meaning a woodpecker. In 1877, Papa's Chase signed on to Treaty 6, and he negotiated a reserve for his Cree band on the south side of the North Saskatchewan River in what is now South Edmonton. Papa's Chase represented 249 members and should have received at least 48 square miles, but after a dispute about the surveyed land, he was granted 40 square miles of land, and only 188 band members were included. At the time, the area south of the river was known as Strathcona, which was separate from Edmonton on the north side of the river. This is what Strathcona looked like at the time, down White Avenue. On the north side of the river, this is what Jasper Avenue looked like in Edmonton. It wasn't until 1912 that the city of Strathcona amalgamated with Edmonton, and the expanding towns were both keen to find prime land for settlers.
White settlers in the district began to petition the government to remove the band. On January 13, 1881, a crowd of settlers held a meeting at the Edmonton Hotel to demand that the Papa's Chase band be moved 20 miles south of the river. They sent 2 petitions to Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, advising against any Cree reserves close to a great central point like Edmonton. Settlers began to build cabins and cut timber on the Papa's Chase land. Frank Oliver, who subsequently became Canada's Minister of the Interior, through his newspaper, the Edmonton Bulletin, pressed Ottawa to remove the Papa's Chase Reserve and open up the land for settlers. By this time, the buffalo had become virtually extinct, and the Indians in the Edmonton area were suffering from severe starvation. So the government devised the Half-Breed Scrip Commission, offering scrip to people of mixed Indigenous and white ancestry, including any treaty status Indian who could show they were of Métis ancestry. By taking scrip, they lost their treaty status, their right to the land, and their right to any treaty payments. In exchange, they received a scrip certificate, which entitled the bearer to receive $160 or 160 acres of homestead land somewhere else at a later date upon presentation of the document to the proper authorities. Land was valued at $1 per acre. Money and land scrip could only be redeemed at face value through a Dominion Lands office. However, there was a considerable black market in scrip, where the scrip certificates were sold to scrip speculators and traded at less than their face value to pay debts and to purchase goods other than land. In 1885, 12 members of the Papa's Chase Band took Métis scrip and were discharged from treaty. In 1886, 102 members took Métis scrip and were removed from the Papa's Chase Band list. That only left 82 members left on their list. They were all removed by 1887. The Papa's Chase Band lost its entire reserve in South Edmonton under highly questionable circumstances when 3 men signed a surrender document on November 19, 1888 at a meeting called with 4 days' notice by the government agent. The federal government subdivided the reserve and sold most of the land at auctions in 1891 and 1893. 7 land speculators bought most of it and resold it to settlers. Band members moved to surrounding reserves and beyond. Some settled on the Enoch Reserve. This is the land that was granted to the Papa's Chase from 51st Avenue North, where we find the Papa's Chase Reservoir, to 34th Avenue south of the Anthony Henday, and from 119th Street West to 17th Street East. When many of these neighborhoods were developed by the city, they were given Indigenous names, and Edmonton public schools were named accordingly. This huge parcel of land now constitutes much of southwest and southeast Edmonton, and is heavily occupied by settlers who may well be unaware of its history. On the other side of the river, Tommy Lapotak brought the Enoch Band members into Treaty 6 in 1877. The Enoch Cree Nation was named for its second chief, Enoch Lapotak, who led the community after 1884. Settlers in Stony Plain and Edmonton businessmen asked the federal government for the full surrender of the Enoch Reserve in 1898 and again in 1899. Enoch Band members refused, but with no access to funds, on the advice of Indian agent James Gibbons, who was a friend of Frank Oliver's, they surrendered 37 square kilometers of their land in 1902 in exchange for fencing and farm implements that could have been claimed under treaty. In 1908, an additional 10 sections or 6,300 acres on the east side, including land that connected the Cree to the river, were surrendered. Edmonton businessmen John A. McDougall and Richard Secord bought 70% of this Enoch land. In 2004, the Enoch Cree First Nation received a $54 million settlement with the Government of Canada over land claim that covers a large area of West Edmonton. The settlement related to the 16 square kilometers surrendered under duress in 1908. Former Chief Clark Peacock said an overzealous Indian agent encouraged the community to sell off that part of the reserve during a time of starvation and struggle. So these funds were used for economic development initiatives being planned for the community, including a resort-style casino on their land, the River Cree Casino, which honors the lost land that connected Enoch to the river. As we begin to wrap up our journey, let's visit the Palliser map of 1857. When Palliser visited the area, he noted the Beaver Hills, or Amiskwaciy, as well as Fort Edmonton. Further to the south, he also noted the Bear Hills, or Musquechies. These were hills covered in blueberries that would attract the bears into the area. This community is about an hour south of where Edmonton lies today. When the railway came through this area in 1891, the president of the Canadian Pacific Railway renamed it in honor of his favorite Dutch landscape painter, a man who had never visited the continent and who died 100 years previously. He renamed this community Hobbema. In 2013, the community was officially re-given its traditional name, Amiskwaciy. As the press at the time said, reclaiming the traditional names for Amiskwaciy territory instills a sense of pride in Cree values, language, culture, and history, and a sense of belonging among the four nations, especially for the youth. In particular, as the bear is so significant to the history, culture, and spirituality of the Plains Cree at Amiskwaciy. For this reason, I included a bear in the bottom corner of my painted map. Finally, to the south of Edmonton, between the communities of Nisku, which sounds like Niska, the goose, and Amiskwaciy, or Bear Hills, you find the settlement of Wetaskiwin. Its name comes from the Cree word Wetaskiwinnik, meaning hills of peace, referring to the nearby Peace Hills, where the Cree and the Blackfoot signed a treaty in 1867 after a lengthy battle. This then is a look at the completed map, with its signature animals that have so much meaning, and with its plants and sacred medicines, and of course with its name, amiskwaciy-wâskahikan. It's my hope that as you travel this community and live upon the land, you consider the Indigenous history on this land, and that we continue to re-examine the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. If you're interested in learning more about the history of our community, there are a number of fascinating sites and books to explore. If I was to choose only one, I would begin with Edmonton in Our Own Words by Linda Goyette. This is a book that was published by the University of Alberta Press in 2004. It's an excellent resource. This project was put together with much support and encouragement from a number of individuals to whom I am very grateful. If the stories in this presentation inform or inspire further learning, then I'm pleased. If there are errors or omissions, these are mine alone. Thank you for joining me on my journey. Hi.